Hello, I'm Sudipto Mondal, and welcome to What's Your Ism? It's a show about political ideologies and theories of change in an increasingly volatile and ever-changing world. Now, those of you who follow this show, I'm sure, are aware that what we are focused on is what's vital and not what's viral. The activists, thinkers, authors, lawyers, journalists, and intellectuals we've featured on this show have left me more educated, and I hope that's been your experience too. The show is also built on things I learned through several years as a field reporter. In all these years, I've traveled to different parts of the country and the world to understand people and their political motivations. If you think that my physical and mental labor brings value to your life, if you find yourself educated by this show, please consider compensating the News Minute for the people and infrastructure they've invested in a show like this. You could also directly fund the production of What's Your Ism by paying whatever amount you think is appropriate directly by scanning this QR code. Alright, welcome to the final episode of Epar Opar Hahakaar, the special focused series on the Bengali nation across borders. This is the installment that I've been waiting for the most. Dr. Navine Murshid, author of India's Bangladeshi Problem. Thank you so much for joining What's Your Ism?
Thank you, Sudipto. I'm glad we finally connected and that I'm here today. I'm looking forward to this.
Naveen, this is such a joy, pleasure. I can't tell you how much your work means to me as a Bengali twice, thrice removed, because my family moved, I was telling you, about more than 100 years ago. Also, because of what I see as a reporter in different parts of India, particularly in Bangalore, where I report out of, where I see this large Bengali Muslim population and have struggled to understand the origin of their chains. And that is where your work came in so useful, so handy. So congratulations on that book of yours. It's brilliant. This is a special segment of What's Your Ism focused on Bengal. I'm calling it Epar Opar Hahakaar. Epar Opar means this side and that side. It's a reference to the two Bengals on either side of the international border. Epar Opar Hahakaar. Hahakaar means a great human tragedy in Bengali, a massive humanitarian disaster. To my mind, that's exactly what's happening to millions of Dalits and lower caste Bengali Muslims on both sides of that murderous international border. Hahakaar. This is a look at Bengal beyond the elections and beyond the borders. An investigation into the Bengali Dalits and Bengali Muslims whose lives today are scattered across the region that was once the larger Bengal presidency under the British, or the Bangla Suba, or province of the Mughals. In this series, I'll be joined by three experts. The first is Nadira Khatun, the author of the critically acclaimed book Post-Colonial Bollywood and the Muslim Representation. You might remember that she came on this show and we discussed her book. Nadira Khatun has helped me curate this special series and I owe her a big thank you. After Nadira, in the second episode, I have R. Khalimullah, a trade unionist and human rights activist based in Bangalore who has been extensively working with the persecuted Bengali migrant laborers in this city. This conversation will be in Dharini, a South Indian language. And in the final episode, I have a very special guest from the other side of Bengal, Dr. Navine Murshid, author of India's Bangladesh Problem. Her book is a critique of neoliberal capitalism and religious fundamentalism in both India and Bangladesh. Now, before we start, for one final time, tell me honestly, you don't think all this effort is worth a little bit of your money? Not even 500 rupees? You could also directly fund the production of What's Your Ism by paying whatever amount you think is appropriate directly by scanning this QR code. before I get into the book, give me some khobor from Opar. You guys have just got a new government at the end of an interim government which lasted longer than it should have after the revolution. There's so much that's happened. Opar, ekটু khobor. What's the khobor?
Well, first, we actually call this Epar, but, and I guess that's the Epar Opar Hahakaar, right? These are interesting times in a way, a time when we are, holding our breath, hoping for some positive change. And so the uprising that happened in 2024 brought in a lot of hope, right? That, because at heart it was a movement that was anti-authoritarian, that wanted to say no to a repressive government, to the use of state violence to solve political problems, right? So to that degree, that so many people took to the streets to say no to that after 15 years of complacency, right? Because, we've been talking about how complacent people have been, how people were just accepting all kinds of decimation of rights, of speech, of mobility, and then for 2024 to happen, it was actually quite incredible, right? But very quickly, the contradictions were very obvious too. So on the one hand, this hope for democratic change, but on the other, the recognition that authoritarianism and the history of authoritarianism is not just about policy, right? It is also about how minds are brought into the fold, how behaviors are brought into check, right? How, by not speaking out for so many years, you actually forget how to speak out, right? You actually forget how to engage in democratic practice. You forget what democracy even probably means, right? And I think that's what we've sort of understood, that, on the one hand, a lot of hopeful words coming out, right, during the movement about inclusivity, about progressive change, about equality. And then in the post-uprising moment, sort of having to come to terms with the fact that our understanding of these concepts are also compromised, right? That, in the absence of a democratic culture or a political culture of democracy, we may have learned these words, right? We may be able to use these words. We may even be able to identify injustice where it exists, but we might not actually have a way to move away from it, to reimagine a different way, right? And I think that's the tension that we've been grappling with since the uprising. And so there have been elections. And like you said, that, I think what was a little problematic is that there weren't clear time frames, right? How long would an interim government last? And in the absence of a time frame, in this kind of a space where people are used to being repressed, you assume the worst. You assume that, okay, here is maybe this interim government just wants to stay in power for a very long time. And so we see a lot of non-cooperation. We see the bureaucracy not functioning very well. We see the interim government actually not being able to exert the kind of control that you expect, right? And then the talk of how it's because it's not a political government, right? That, on the one hand, we have this rule by experts, even, you can say, yeah? Because, this is a highly educated group of people who became advisors in this interim period. And in that sense, you can even think of it as an experiment, right? Even a neoliberal experiment, right? Where we think about the state takes a back seat, right? And, the sort of fascination that neoliberals have about rule by experts, right? As opposed to a democratic government, right? And here was your experiment, right? That here's group of experts, although with more expertise probably in running NGOs than anything else. But even then, given that the NGO experience in Bangladesh from their perspective has been a very successful one, the NGOs have been the reason why Bangladesh has a fairly high human development index, high education rates even among girls, and infant mortality, health indicators. Yes, these things Bangladesh has been doing well on, and for that you can thank the NGOs. And so this, in a way, I think for those of us who are more cynical, this was a sort of like, okay, here is the next step, right? This is the natural next step that, okay, here we will have a rule by experts. They will, in their expert ways, make this work. But on the other hand, what became clear was that without a certain kind of political legitimacy, you actually cannot run these political institutions. Also, I think this is critical, because our political institutions are not democratic either. That they have always been beholden to the political party in power, and it's the patronage system that allows them to run, right? And so, what the interim period then showed was, now that you didn't know who to bribe, now that you didn't know who your patrons were, you couldn't function, right? And so there was this sort of chaos, right? So on the one hand, you could say that, this is the lack of a political government, but on the other hand, this was also a result of entrenched corruption that has come to mar the political institutions. And I think now with the new government in power, the question is, are we going to just go back to the old ways, or are we actually going to take a step further? I think what was really sad about the interim government, in a way, was that I think after a while, people began to say that, okay, we will just go back to what we know. Okay, yes, that's corrupt. Yes, that's repressive. But at least it's something that we know and we can work with. Here, there's a lot of chaos, right? Again, for a number of reasons, right? Part of it is political reasons. Part of it is the way in which patronage systems work, and the inability to figure out how to make this work, right? And so that's the chaos. And then moving forward now in the present moment, I think we are kind of waiting with bated breath. That where are we headed? And some of it, some of it is good. There's some good things happening, at least on the front of identity politics, on the front of, historical accountability, the engagement with the Jamaat-e-Islami and so on. And I guess, in terms of maybe stemming a certain kind of right-wing surge, right? Maybe this is a step in the right direction. But then in terms of, the old things, right, like political institutions and independence and democratic practice and so on, I think, we're going to have to wait and see.
Wow, thank you. That is a great primer. I hope everyone listened to every word over there with rapt attention, because each of the things you said is the entry point of a rabbit hole. You talked about the Jamaat, you talked about the interim government, you talked about this rule by experts. What an interesting coinage there. Rule by experts. This kind of this supercharged bureaucracy, unelectable perhaps, without a maths base. There's so much in there, and I hope again our Indian audience can see the parallels. That this is not a nation state too different in the way it functions from India. There may be, of course, differences in terms of its timeline of history. I mean, military rule happened, so many other things. But my interest now in this period of transition really is this was projected as a turning point. The straw that broke the camel's back was the protest against some very flawed, misguided reservation policies in Bangladesh. And the conversation throughout, from what I heard based on my conversations with my sources in Bangladesh, the experts, is that constitutional amendment is a big thing on the anvil. It could happen. The interim government was constantly discussing about certain fundamental structural changes that need to be now introduced into how Bangladesh is governed. That thing is something. If you can just talk briefly before we get into your book, what are these hopes and desires out of this new constitution, if at all? Is it on the anvil, like I was told? Is it not a point in consideration right now? One of the most exciting things, one of the exciting things I heard about the constitutional amendment is that, you could have now affirmative action for actually marginalized groups as opposed to some veterans of a war, right? Because one of the biggest chunks of people who had reservations in Bangladesh were people, progeny, intergenerationally, in perpetuity, children of veterans of the Bangladesh Liberation War. So this thing, what is it about this potential that excites you more? What do you think, if it's introduced, will change Bangladesh fundamentally?
Sudipto, I think you've got me at a time when I'm very cynical, right? So please excuse my pessimism. But I'm going to say it with a smile, so it doesn't sound so pessimistic, right? So the thing is that, okay, again, there's so many aspects to what you pointed out. So let's start with what you started with, right? The quota reform movement, right? And I think what the way I like to formulate that, or to understand that in an analytical sense, is to sort of point out how that reflected the economic times, right? So, that it happened at a time when the economy was, faring very poorly. It was at a time when university graduates were not really getting jobs. The job prospects were very poor. And then alongside, you would see in the newspapers these stories of money-related scandals, of money being looted and transferred abroad, and all these kinds of financial scandals, right? Which spoke to the kind of wealth that some people have been able to amass, despite a really poor economy, right? And so very critical was the inequality that was now very visible. So what was actually interesting, and I think in a way what even maybe, I think it competes with the quota reform issue, was this story of a goat. I don't know if you've heard of that. So it was Eid, the Eidul Azha, the Eid where you sacrifice cows, right? And so this kid, I think a 15, 16-year-old kid, who's the son of some some government service individual in taxes, actually. So he went and bought this goat for an enormous amount of money. And then not only did he do that, he made this reel of himself and posted it on social media, and then, gloating about how expensive that goat was, and dressed it up. And, this, in a way that I think he was thinking that he's going to sort of, gloat about it, of course, but, kind of also clown around, right? But then again, that was one of those things that made very clear that at a time when people were not being able to, of course, buy animals for slaughter, or even parts of it. And here was one.
Such a Marie Antoinette moment, such a why don't they have cake moment, right?
Absolutely.
My goodness, okay.
And talk about, shoving it in your face, right? That, here is what I have and you do not, right? And so I think, what is it that makes people angry? It is this sort of exuberant show of wealth, right? And this sort of, very crass, crude show of wealth. Right. And so there was that. And so these are the things that were happening at the same time, right? Of the quota movement, which again sort of showed that here are kids who are fighting for a job. And here are some kids who can just waste money like that. Right. So, I think the quota movement, I would say, is a reflection of that, right? The dire economic situation of the time, right? And the quota itself was problematic because, the way in which you identify Muktijuddha or martyrs is problematic. Again, prone to corruption. You could buy a document that says you're a war veteran. And then, this is their intergenerationally, like grandkids and so on, great grandkids, they can have access to it, right? And so in a way, there was that aspect too, right? But at the same time, and I think I remember at the time when I was following the news, thinking that, they could make this into a really important movement, right? Because there are all of these elements, right? Like you said, to move towards a path where affirmative action actually targets the marginalized, right? But no. Right. And that was, I think, if we are to sort of think about, what were the early signs of problems within the movement, I would say it was that. Right. And I remember, my partner and I, we were talking about this, that why are they not putting that forward? Right. Why are they taking effectively an anti-affirmative action stance? Because of that, there were so many of us who didn't really weigh in on it. Right. Okay. We understood that you want jobs and the economy is, in a dire situation, and you are unhappy with the quota system. But why are you not making these demands a little bit more broad, right? Why are you not including marginalized groups? Why are you not asking for a fair process? Instead, what is it that you asked? You asked for a meritocratic system. Right? Again, the classic way in which affirmative action is tackled with, right? And medha, which is the word for merit, that became the slogan: medha, not quota. And so I think that was the sort of, for those of us who wanted to support this movement, this was a moment where we really could not, right? And so in a way, what is it that made people like me actually then support this group? It was when the state started using violence, right? That, okay, you might have bad politics, but we can't still kill you for it. We might not like your politics, but we do not have the right to kill you, right? And that's where it went, right? When the state started targeting these students, that's when it became, I think, a moment that I think in that sense, it's the state that turned a reform movement into an uprising, right? Just by using force, because again, it was obvious that these were these students, and you just can't do that in a place where you claim there's democracy, even if you don't like them, even if they are terrorists, right? And that's the thing. I think that what we've come to realize is that there's this political culture of violence where you think it's okay to kill people if you think they're terrorists, right? Not recognizing that even terrorists have rights, right? That even they have human dignity, but you are not going to do that. So you're going to identify them as terrorists and use that as a way to legitimize violence against them, legitimize killing them. Right. And again, Sudipto, you talked about parallels, right? In India, and this is something you hear there too, right? It's not very different. We follow the same kind of playbook, right? We share these kinds of ideas, and very specifically, it's not just in the realm of ideas. It's also in the realm of specific policies, like the Digital Security Act that we've had, right? That you could use as a way to identify those who are traitors to the nation state, and use that as a way to jail them arbitrarily without rights, and so on and so forth, right? That has been used, and there are versions of it that would remain, right? That you think that with time, with the uprising, with the new government, you would not get arrested for Facebook posts, for speaking out, and you still do. And I think here is another sort of lost opportunity, if you will, because what we've seen during the interim government is that they brought together two elements that were foundational to the Constitution, right? One element was ideological, right? What is the state about? What are the principles of the state? Secularism, democracy, socialism. Okay, sure, we didn't actually have socialism, right? I think you could look at these principles and say that in effect or in practice, these things didn't actually exist. You could say that, okay, maybe these are aspirational, or it allows for a debate about what does this Bangladeshi sense of socialism actually mean, right? And there's some literature on it. What did Sheikh MUJIB actually mean? That here is whatever it is that we have here. Socialism in practice as we go along. You build it as you go along. That kind of a thing. But okay, some aspirational sense. Are there problems there? Sure. Is it for debate? Sure. But in sort of making that political project, I think it made a lot of people very worried, right? Why are you getting rid of secularism? Why are you replacing these words? Introducing words like human dignity, of equality, of multiculturalism, and so and in effect they wanted to say that they're doing the same thing. They're keeping the same ideas, but they are getting rid of certain aspects of it, right? And I feel like this is where some debate would have been very useful, right? Because why equality and not equity, right? Which is a little bit more responsive to different marginalized groups, because equality is not necessarily always fair, right? So if we are to tackle secularism, then again we needed a debate, about the origins of secularism, the Western origins of secularism, what Eastern secularism is, the Christian roots of secularism, and so on and so forth. These are the debates I think that needed to have happened, but it did not, right? And so we just in the committee that was overseeing constitutional reform, we've seen these changes brought in, and the debates or the discussion were not made public, and so that became a source of a lot of angst. Right? That what does it even mean? And so changing the preamble, again, something that people were not really happy about. But at the same time, there were another set of changes that they proposed, which I would say, I think, from an analytical or political position, that those were actually necessary, right? Because what they tried to do was address the Constitution and the constitutional amendments that essentially made the Prime Minister's seat very powerful, right? And so as a way to balance that power. So a slew of reforms that would reduce the power given to that seat and distribute it among other institutions also, right? So basically, in order to prevent another authoritarian turn, right? Rule by diktat, so that's what it was engaged with, right? So by combining these two, the ideological, where people were very emotionally involved, and then the more practical, which are necessary for a move towards a democratic culture, even, create a lot of confusion. Right? So there was alongside the vote for who the parliamentarians, there was a referendum, right, that would ask people about whether they supported these constitutional reforms, right? Except that it in a vote that had so many elements that they couldn't, I think like 48 or so elements, they condensed it in a sort of generalized way into 4, and then you allowed for a yes and no vote. Right? So you either say yes to everything or no to everything. When in fact, of course, for most people, it was a combination. We like certain aspects of it and we don't like these others, right? And again, especially when they included the ideological or emotional, if you will, aspects of constitutional reform with the more structural, organizational, institutional, then there's a problem. So I think for the most part, people would say that yes, we need institutional reform, but about questions of what's the idea of the state, that's a bigger question. You cannot just through policy change what the nation state is about, right? That's obviously going to create a lot of backlash, right? And so that's where we were. The vote actually did pass, so people did vote mostly for reform, about 60%. But now there's a debate over whether that's going to actually be enacted. So that's the debate that has been ongoing in the parliament, and the prime minister has been saying that no, we are serious about reform. We're not going to enact them in this way. We will effectively incorporate them into the changes that are coming. And then there are other politicians like the home minister who has actually said that we signed it because we felt that if we didn't, then we wouldn't be able to move forward. And I think this was the thing that the question even then, when they put forward these kinds of reforms, what is an elected government to do? Is it democratic or anti-democratic to impose these kinds of reforms on an elected government, right? But then what does a referendum do? Does the referendum then say that, in the interest of democracy, some of these have to be put forward, right? And I think there are some, I personally think that institutionally, they could have stopped the conversation at the level of conversation, right? Saying that, okay, here are the important issues that emerge from the constitution. We will take it up on the floor, post elections, and we'll have a debate about that. So what we're having now instead, basically a debate about whether we should follow the referendum or not. So that's where it's mired in, and it's actually not clear whether these reforms would actually mean anything. And so, there are 18 months of discussions and, wasting of money. And we have no sense of what kind of reforms would actually be put forward, right? And so, again, there's this, you have to understand that there is always this fear, right? In the recent past here, that whoever gets to political power will not get rid of it, right? They will do their best to hold on to political power. Yeah? And so if these reforms are not enacted somehow, then that does not bode very well. I think it gives the message that they too might be trying to hold on to political power for as long as they can. And, so again, there's in the absence of actual information and good intel, conspiracy theories are abound about what these prospects might be.
Wow, fantastic. Well, as I was listening to that, my mind kept popping with the intersections. There's these brothers from other mothers across the border. And while I was feeling that, I was also feeling this very strong sense of my sister from another mister kind of a thing, in terms of, how much we agree in terms of how we frame the development question down to these two words of equality and equity, and how they don't mean the same thing, and they probably sometimes are always, sometimes they contest each other as well. Right? And so much of the development conversation in mosaic societies like South Asia get caught in these two binaries of equity and equality. And to my mind, if you allow me, this equality business really comes down to, just take out the barriers in our way, stop being so corrupt, just make sure that the road before me is clear. That's the equality conversation to my mind. And the equity conversation is really like, give me a better car, better fuel, give me force multipliers, if you like. That's the equity conversation, social justice conversation for me, which oftentimes gets subordinated in the face of such, monumental corruption. Yeah. And therefore the whole equity question gets sidelined, saying that, just give us clean governance. Just give us a few checks and balances by which power is distributed and not accumulated in a center, and all of that. And so while you're speaking of these things, I feel such a strong sense of fraternity with ideologues on that side who are on the left, who are able to see the texture in the conversation, the fact that what we need is not a meritocratic approach to this thing, to take into account that merit was this concept that was introduced in in these convent schools, to kind of say that, okay, this is the civilized and this is the uncivilized. Also,
to exacerbate inequality, actually.
Absolutely, to create a have and have not, and a doctor and a chasha. So
that's right, and let's keep the chasha away.
Let's keep the chasha away. But all of this kind of thinking is not very popular, no, Naveen. I mean, before now, this is the last thing I want to discuss before actually getting into the section into your book. What is it like being a lefty in Bangladesh? What is it like to be who you are? The way you think? And this book, which I believe cannot have many friends on either side of the border. You're going after the Indian government, you're going after the Bangladeshi establishment, you are talking about, what was your experience?
Like a friend of mine has said that, do you want to live anywhere? It's hard. It's demoralizing, I'll say. And and I'm not even the leftist of the lefties. I think I'm more pragmatic. I understand the sort of capitalist desires and hopes and aspirations, even if I don't agree with it. Right? That I understand how people are motivated by it. I see, and I guess in part because like you've seen in my book. I mean, you can't tell someone that, no, that is not real, right? Because for them, it's real, right? That it's very strong, the sense that development is coming my way. And, the way to get to it is a good road, a good bridge. And these highways that are being constructed with my taxpayers' money, they're actually somehow beneficial for me. And look, does it not look really beautiful? Does it not look like the West, or does it not look very developed? And taking pride in these kinds of infrastructural development, neoliberal projects, right, at the individual level. I mean, I think in a way it's incredible. And I say this also, that, and if I've said this in my book also, right, that if we are to talk about something like neoliberal sensibility, the degree to which we ascribe to these neoliberal ideas of personal responsibility, of a withdrawing state, of development by the bootstraps, I think there's a significant level of buy-in here, right? I think one thing that I've come to recognize is that people here actually don't expect much from the state. Right? They've not learned to hold the state accountable. They don't expect the state to pay for their health, for their education, and so on. Whatever they do is sort of like bonus, right? And so it's incredible how this has been cultivated. And then in part, it's perhaps because of the NGOs, right? So if you need something, you go to the NGO hospital, there are NGO schools, not to the scale that, that would address the entire population, but significantly so. Right? And so this sense that, we will develop our way towards prosperity and develop in the sort of neoliberal sense, right? So that's really strong. And so to counter that is obviously, not very easy. People will tell you that, be a little bit more practical. Of course, we need this kind of jobs. What else are we going to do, right? And I think where we are in a way stuck is that even if we say buy in to the capitalist structure of development, right, and we believe that this is how progress will happen, I mean, this is good. I mean, I will eventually contradict myself because there is that.
Go on. These are those those twilight moments in trying to figure out the world. Where we are not exactly in a position to say yes or no. So, but go on, please. Yeah, no, I'm interested.
No, because these are written in contradictions, right? So if we sort of accept that and we sort of think about the RMG sector here, the garment sector, which is like. It's like, one of Bangladesh's largest source of income. The country will fall flat without the income that it generates from this sector. Right? And everyone knows this, right? This is not a secret, not a surprise to anyone, right? And yet we continue to produce at the lowest level of the supply chain, right? At that level where you require the least skilled or unskilled workers, right? And I think here is that kind of coming together of a state that thinks that, wait, I do not need to educate my people anymore because our unskilled workers are enough to get us this economy, right? And so you pay no attention to the education system, and you look around and you will see how that affects the country, the economy at every level. The lack of skilled workers is a major problem, but you refuse to skill them. In a way you would think that as a capitalist, why do you accept that? Do you not want to move up that supply chain? Do you not want to get into markets where you produce more labor intensive, skill intensive products? But no, we are happy at the lowest chain. But what that does is it also means that the economy is very vulnerable to global shifts, to financial crisis, to COVID, to what have you, right? The free trade treaty that we are having to deal with, right? So the reason why we are in this state is because of this kind of an economic structure, right? And so it's not unrelated. Right? So on the one hand, you can see that, okay, we will accept your logic that capitalism will get us to progress, that motivation will get you to educate yourself more, perhaps, and you're going to do really well. But then you see in practice that that's actually not happening. Right? You see that there is no progress. You see there's no motivation. You see there's no innovation, really. You are stagnating at that very low level. Right. So, so I feel like even if you are sort of, in that capitalist mode, there's only so much that you can get to. Right. And yet there is this perpetual hope that you somehow will, and I guess there is, and that's what I mean, that ideological sense, right? The neoliberal sensibility is so strong, right? And yet, we can't deny, right, that for a woman coming from a rural area to work in a garments factory, for her is kind of liberating, right? Because she's not, working in the field with very little pay, with minimum conditions, with very little freedom to even move, structured by patriarchy in rural spaces. And here in this workspace, which is also oppressive, also patriarchal, the fact that she chooses this gives her a sense that this is somewhat better, and who am I to then say that no, this is not better? Even if I think it's not better, even if I think that, but, isn't, you're open to sexual harassment, you're having to work overtime with very little pay, you're living in these horrific conditions in these urban slums with very little social protection. But then who am I to say, when they say that this is more liberating and better than their rural existence, so that's where I am, right? That, I'm trying to give them their due to that. They're agentic in that sense, right? They have agency in that way. They're actually choosing in a very constrained set. This choice is a constrained choice, but this is all they can do. And with the way that the economy is, like I said, where we are focusing really just on this lowest level of production, this is where we all stagnate, right? There's, development, but only at that level where you move from the peasantry into these factories, and then you basically stagnate for life, right? Without any kind of reskilling, without any movement along the supply chain, even in a capitalist world, you don't really make much progress.
Sure. And again, the mirror opposite in India. What you're talking about mirrors the reality of millions of gig workers now. right? That's the new bus thing over here in India. Cool. So that's a great segment already. What we have spoken about. I mean, it's such an education to understand Bangladesh from your perspective. I'll take a small commercial break if you'll allow me quickly. Okay, to remind our audiences about the effort that went into just putting this together. Not just the emotional labor that is separate, but the fact that I had to read like 4 census reports. 3 books, speak to experts on both sides of the border to curate this conversation. And this costs money. I mean, it costs money in terms of time. So the question I'm asking is, do you think this episode is worth 500 rupees, which is your subscription? Do consider taking a News Laundry News Minute subscription. How bad is independent media in Bangladesh, Naveen?
Oh my goodness, Sudipto. I think that's where a little bit of the gig economy has filtered in to Bangladesh, right? There are a lot of new media platforms now. I mean, not a lot, not compared to India, of course. But, there are some of these, and they're doing well in a limited sense, right? But I think, in this day of disinformation and misinformation, this is crazy. I mean, there's no way to really, at the first cut, realize whether something is true or false. And you'll see misinformation in the most reliable of places, and they're having a difficult time too, right? Figuring out what's happening, whether something is true or false. So there's that, and I think I don't know, Sudipto, I'm sorry for my cynicism, just, one thing that could have been great, was these online platforms, right, where we can speak a little bit more openly, where we are not censored as much, where we actually can speak more, openly, and yet we have a public that is so prone to cancel culture. They will, and I think we have to come back to this political culture of conformity, political culture of not questioning, right? So if you say something that is a little different from what you've heard all along, all your life, if you hear a different explanation, a different analysis, you clearly don't know anything. Where have you gotten your degree? Do you know anything? You know nothing. You spend so much time abroad that you've forgotten what's going on, but then what counts as evidence would be all these conspiracy theories, right? And then they will also tell you that there is always truth to some conspiracy theories, which, of course, in a way, sure, in that sort of no smoke without fire kind of a thing, but and how conspiracy theories are a legitimate source of analysis. Right. And so what people will counter you with, I guess this sort of piggybacks on the last question too, would be that, but have you heard that? And here, my insider source here says blah, blah, blah. And then, but over there was this meeting between these critical people, and I have information that this is what was being discussed. Right. And so, it's difficult to sort of tell people that, when we are analyzing, if we sort of look at what is even publicly available, you sort of get a good sense, right? Based on what interests people have, what interests people might have, what, let's say geopolitical interests are, what makes sense for them. That would get you quite far. You don't actually have to buy into conspiracy theories in order to say that, let's say, the United States has an interest in South Asia. Right? It's not a conspiracy theory, right? But what you will see is that, unless you are offering that kind of information about secret intels and recorded calls and so on, then that is actually, not something that is worth considering. So there's this way in which information stands in for analysis, and that information is always, or almost always, quite suspect. Right. And so this is the public that we kind of have. And if you kind of deviate, again, as I was saying, if you deviate from, what is normal, then, they're going to try and delegitimize you and sort of say that, you're wrong and you are out of your depth and, you know so little and so on. And more so, I think the other thing here that's, kind of sad is that most people, most institutions, most entities can be seen through a party lens. So either you're this party or that, either Awami League or BNP or Jamaat and so on. And if you are outside of that, then you're somehow suspicious. Then either you're confused or you don't know. And, again, if you are critical of the Jamaat, then how dare you criticize the Awami League? If you criticize the Awami League, how dare you criticize BNP? If you, that kind of a thing, that you have to choose. And so this way in which that you only see wrongdoing if it's from the opposing political party, but not your own, right? This is so entrenched, right? And if you do, then you're somehow a traitor, right? And so with it comes all kinds of identity politics, right? So for example, I've had people tell me that, you sing Rabindra Sangeet, how could you support the July uprising? I mean, and you're like, what? But these are the sort of very superficial ways in which they're going to try and box you into a certain category where you somehow fall within a party platform, right? And so if you're not this, you must be that, right? And if you're not any of that, then you're just, you're just worthless because you're confused and you know nothing, So that's where the sort of I think that's the struggle that independent media is facing currently, that they're trying to be a little bit more open. They're trying to be more inclusive. They're trying to privilege various kinds of voices, marginalized and otherwise, to get a good perspective. But this is the challenge that they're facing in terms of sort of backlash, right? And what's sad is that you'll often have even state representatives chiming in to sort of say, here's something problematic, behaving sort of like trolls, So that's the political culture surrounding, I think, independent media right now. It's completely under the what can I say? It's completely kind of marred by trolls, right? You kind of have to bear that in mind. And so what that does is it sort of forces you to censor yourself, right? Because after a while you say that I don't want to be the victim of this language, this vitriol, and so let me not say that anymore. And so hence, the moment you get to self-censorship, you've done the job.
No, because what you talk about reminds me of this time when I used to, back in the old days when you used to have only these legacy publications and newspapers in India. We would talk about how the letters to editor section was very undemocratic because some editor would be sitting to, cut out the critical stuff. And now, now we have an overcompensation where every person on the street can just spit on your face and go. And again, to underline these struggles, I hope those of you who follow the News Laundry and News Minute are aware of this most recent case where Manisha Pandey has, lodged this case against Abhishek Mitra Iyer, a troll who used the filthiest kind of language to address our women journalists in News Laundry, particularly Manisha herself. So yeah, I mean, this money, these 500 rupee installments that you give, go to fund so many different things. We need to fight in court. We need to fight defamation cases. Anyway, now, without further delay, let's get into Navine's book, actually. There is so much to talk about as people from two sides of the border talking about Bengal, I mean, there's so much curiosity on this side. So thanks so much for all of that information. But about your book, why is it interesting for me? Because one of the things I invested a lot of time as a journalist to do is understand the oppression, the caste oppression of Dalits in Bengal, because that is where my forefathers, my family comes from. So I know very well the history of the Rajbongshi, Namashudro populations over there, and how they were exploited over time. Now, my curiosity about Bengali Muslims actually started when I started doing fieldwork on their persecution in Bangalore city. They and the entire garbage sector in Bangalore city is where Bengali Muslims are working. I mean, you'll barely ever find somebody from any other community. When I go there, I speak to them for the first time and I ask them their names, is when I see that there is something else I need to ask over here, something else I need to understand. Naam ki Boshirul. Boshirul ki Boshirul Mondal. Naam ki Rafikul. Rafikul ki Rafikul Bishas. All right, so then suddenly I'm thinking, wait a minute, what is the story of the Bengali Muslim? I understand the Bengali Dalit, the Namashudra Rajabongshi, like I said.
Good Bengali Muslim names.
Aren't they? Yeah. And these very, typically Bengali. And for me, it strikes me very deep inside because the person shares my surname, and my surname traces back to our caste identity, So, and the immediate thing for me is that, oh, wow, could it be that this thing that we talk about in India, that caste cuts across religion, could this Muslim who's either from West Bengal, Malda, Murshidabad, wherever, Nudia, or from across the border, is there something more to the origin of their chains, right? And that is where I got into your work, and to understand their contemporary reality, I think their history is very important. The history of the Bengali Muslim. Okay, I want you to take a few minutes again to talk about this origin story. Which part do you want to start with? Do you want to start with how the world's third largest Muslim ethnic group came about? This is also perhaps the world's youngest Muslim ethnic group, just 400 years old, the Bengali Muslim, South Asia's largest, and also one of the most marginalized. Right? So where did this community come from? What does Eaton say? The floor is yours. I mean, because Eaton, one of the things he does is he says that Islam didn't just spread because there were sultans ruling over there. He talks about how the Mughals were in charge, and this sudden emergence of Islam happens after Mughals take over Bengal. Post 1600s, 1700s, that's when this growth happens. And politically, the Mughals are against conversions. They're anti-conversions to the extent that they have punished some of their officers for converting their servants. That's what Eaton's work talks about. So wow, how did this religion come?
I'll start with a caveat, which is I'm not a historian.
No, of course not. So we look at history to understand the present.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I'll get to to the sort of way in which I get to the way in which history does become important. And for which Eaton's work has been so seminal, right? This idea that the spread of religion is not always a violent thing, right? There can be this sort of hearts and minds approach, and it speaks to both the religion, but also the place and the people in that space, right? And so I think here for the Bengali Muslim case, the agrarian roots of Bengal becomes particularly important, right? The fact that here was a people that lived by the sea, it lived by trees and forests, right? Where a sense of spirituality didn't really associate itself with organized religion, right? And I think here is where, the difference between syncretism and mixed faith comes in, right? That in a sense, the I think Richard Eden uses the word syncretic, that, Bengal was a syncretic place to begin with, which is why when Islam came through travelers, through Sufi saints, through Turkish travelers and so on, when they came, they were able to adapt, right? Because it was already a syncretic space. But I think, the way to think about it in a sense would be to sort of think about it not as a syncretic place, but as a place of mixed faith. Right? The difference being that syncretic assumes that there are multiple formed, institutionalized religions, right? As opposed to in Bengal, there are different kinds of faiths, right? But they may not necessarily take an institutionalized form. Right? They might not necessarily have formal rituals, formal practices, organizations, and so on, right? And yet, these are faiths. These are faith-based communities, right? So pantheistic traditions, or, seeing the sun as God, or seeing the forest, Bono Bibi, and so on, right? These sort of multiple ways in which people expressed spirituality or their faith kind of allowed Bengal to see Islamic ideas as one of them, right? And in so doing, I think at the level of spirituality also to sort of recognize that, there need not be that much difference, right? And I think that again speaks to the adaptability on both ends, that Islam allowed for this generous interpretation, right? That it did not require that you give your entire faith to this particular religion and, let go of others, right? It allowed for this sort of mixed faith tradition. And I think this is where what type of Islam becomes useful, right? The fact that this came through Sufi travelers, right? Where the sense of spiritualism, where the idea of the body, of the mind, sort of becomes part of an Islamic tradition also. It's not necessarily just Quranic Islam that is to be read literally, but an idea of Islam where the key element is actually faith. Right? That do you believe that there is this God or not? That is all that's required in a sense, right? And and I think what's interesting is that in this moment there wasn't that insistence that this be the only God, right? And I think that's critical here, right? Which allowed Islam to be incorporated as one of the many religions, as one of the many spiritual identities that you can have that made you more wholesome, right? More the merrier, more the better. The more we have, the more we are in touch with our spirituality, right? And I think that's the sense that we get because of this agrarian space, because here in this agrarian space, people are reliant on nature in a way that people in other parts are not. They are reliant on the skies, on the rains, on the rivers, on the oceans, on the ground, the fertility in the trees and all of that, right? And so wherever you get boon, there's that element of spirituality that, okay, here are the tree gods who's bringing us good fortune. Yes.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just layer some of your commentary on this period with this idea that this could be liberation theology. Why do I say this? Why do I say this is because what was this population before the arrival of Islam? If you don't take that into account, I don't think we would fully appreciate what changes it brought about in the lives of the people of the eastern delta part. Right. So what does Eden's work show? That around about the time when the Mughals were taking charge, the Ganga and the Brahmaputra were also moving east. The Ganga and the Brahmaputra are moving east. And because they're moving east, new floodplains are being created. Therein lies an opportunity, an economic opportunity, which leads the Mughals to encourage what Eden calls pioneers to go to the east and chop off whatever remaining forests there are, because this is before this shifting of the rivers to the east, it was forested land. You have this call to action, which is both economic and liberation theological. I'll talk about the economic aspect. I mean, it's very simple to understand here. There's a revenue opportunity for the Mughals, saying that, hey, there's new land and it can be cultivated and we can extract revenue. And they encouraged a bunch of pioneers who happened coincidentally to be also Sufi in their orientation, and many of them were Ghazis and Peers themselves. So these people set forth to the east and gave this theological interpretation to this economic activity, saying, it suddenly becomes entwined with creationism of a positive kind, not the creationism of the Abrahamic type where you say the woman came from the thigh bone of the man and all of that, but there is, but there is another aspect to this creationism where you locate it, right? You talk about trees and factors of production as being divine. The real liberatory call is, let's go to this promised land, let's fertilize this land, let's populate this land, and let's do this by invoking the creed of Adam or Adam. In the Abrahamic scheme of things, you have the creed of Adam, which is that kind of creationism where you are trying to settle a new civilization. That is the spirit with which they went over there, and that's the sense I get. So as liberation theology, Naveen, I hope I'm not going tangentially over here, but why it's exciting for me, the reason it's exciting for me is because of the populations that took to this faith. These were aquamarine populations dealing with shifting land, shifting forests and mangroves and forests and what have you, rivers. Chandal, Dome, Eaton's work says that they were entirely Chandal, Dome and indigenous populations that took to this new faith, which was a mix of their own indigenous interpretation of nature and Islam. And that leads me to say that, hey, they were introduced to the plow, to the axe, and to the book and pen and paper, or a pencil and a paper, because you cannot be part of the Abrahamic religions if you're not the people of the book. And as a Dalit, for me, this engagement with books is exciting. Why? Because these are populations which have been denied the book. And here comes a liberation theologian who's saying, hey, let's find an occupation firstly, a new occupation, which is agriculture, which is technology for that time, which is a technological innovation for that time. So there's that happening. And also, hey, let's get educated. So there's axe, there's plow, yes, but there's also pen and paper. And in that Quranic, it's not just the Quran, isn't it? It is an accounting system. It is a numerical system. It is science. It is, today the Sanghis in India would say madrasa mein ye sikhate hai, but madrasa mein, there is also science, and there is so much of that. So therefore, liberation theology, I want your comments on that.
I think I was fascinated by this shifting rivers aspect too, right? To sort of see how a civilization emerges. Right? That and of course there's going to be an economic impetus there too, right? And I think that's the overarching theme here too, about how expansion and economic activities are interrelated, right? And that with shifting rivers, you see different populations being privileged. Yeah. I think I'm not, again, I'm not really sure about exactly what instruments, paper, pen, so on, that emerged at the time, right? But I think what I've come to sort of appreciate about the time, and I think, again, in terms of liberation theology, also is this aspect where you see the economic impetus and the faith-based spirituality come together as a way to see these economic activities as boon also. This is not just, exploitation per se, which in a way we could see it as, but I think to sort of also see it as how these are seen as innovation. I think that's how you're sort of thinking of it as liberation theology, right? That look at all the miracles that are happening around us with the plow, with with these new lands. And what we have with shifting rivers is also the emergence of more fertile land. Right. So this is not separate, that they're able to sort of think about the economy as part of their spirituality too, right? And I think that's really incredible, because that's where, as you said, that, when you see the emergence of agriculture, they are very much tied to that land. And that's true even now, right? So today in our today's newspaper just saw this story. There's this fuel crisis, as you know, the diesel is in short supply. And then the rains have started. So this farmer went to his field and saw his entire grains soaked in water, and he died. He just collapsed right there, right? And and it gives you a sense how tied they are to their labor, how tied they are to their land, in a way that, think about alienation of labor under capitalism, how there's that distance, right? Because you have no control over what you're actually producing. You don't even know what you're often producing, right? You are so alienated from the work that you're doing. You're just doing it, but you're alienated from it. As opposed to this kind of a space, it's an economic space, but you are very much tied to it. And you still are. I mean, that's why I tell the story of this farmer, that you still are. You're this is who you are. This is part of your identity. Whatever your spirituality, it's not separate from your economic activity. Right, you're sort of in touch with that, right? And I think that was in a way the beauty of Bengali Islam, if you will, right, or Bengal's Islam, if you will, because it was different. It was different from the Mughal type of Islam. It was different from the North Indian kind of Islam. It was different from the Middle East kind of Islam. And here you had this sort of interpretation. I mean, growing up, we had this sense, like a commonsensical sense, that, Bengali Islam is different. We don't dress like people in the Middle East. We don't dress like other Muslims. We don't wear religion on our sleeves. It's a spiritual thing. It's something about the mind. It's about our own belief. It's not about talking about it. It's not about wearing something to show that this is what my religion is, because my relationship is with God. Right? My relationship is, or the lack of it, is with God too. It's my understanding, whatever that relationship may be. Maybe it's a terrible relationship that I have with God, or a great relation, but it's personal. It's my own. Right. And I think that's the sort of translation to the contemporary period that we've had, right, in as part of Bangladesh emerging in a sort of nationalistic way. Right? What kind of an Islamic identity would it be? And I think it's sort of it was sort of normalized along those lines. And because this was a refrain that we've heard, that Islam here didn't come through swords. Came through love. It came through Sufi saints. It came through mazars, and so that wasn't really contradictory in any way, right? I don't know if I'm actually answering your question.
Oh, you are. You're bringing tears to my eyes. I mean, honestly.
I don't know. I mean, maybe there's this a certain sort of idealism in me that kind of wants to see that past, in a more fluid sense, where the identity is more fluid, right? Where the caste categories or religious categories are later impositions, right? That at the time, these were not necessarily what informed the practice of the Quran, right? And I think that's where, colonialism becomes so important. That's where this agricultural work becomes important too, right? On the one hand, we can romanticize this idea of agricultural living for peasant existence as tied to the land and, so spiritually involved. And yet it is very hard work, right? At the same time, it is very labor intensive, and it means that people are now settling down, right? That settled culture becomes a requirement, right? That if you are cultivating these lands, because on the one hand, we can talk about shifting rivers and how this is a mobile population, but at the same time, these shifts are not day-to-day shifts. These are shifts taking place over long periods of time, right? And so with these shifts, we see shifts in what the population looks like, because this is also, the rivers taking away lives, creating new chars and so on. Right? And so there is that's also happening at the same time, which I think as we see, quote unquote, progress, we see the requirement of differentiated labor, and which then becomes the basis of various caste categories, right? Which is why this idea that there's you'll hear people say that there's no caste in Bangladesh, which is of course not true, right? Because there's no caste in a sort of institutionalized sense. You don't know what that is, but there are caste ideas, right? Casteist prejudice, right? There is, if we are to think of caste, like Ambedkar, I think is who said, right, that it's a division of workers, right? No, that if we are to sort of think about caste as this sort of division of workers, we realize that of course there is, right? Because if you sort of think about how, that then translate into prestige and belonging and all of that, and I guess we can map that onto that agrarian space too, on the basis of who does what work.
Okay, I mean, so many things got triggered by what you said, and I'm trying to now grab onto one of them. Let's see. So settling down, what does it mean for people who are seen as undesirables, or and the reason I say this is because you have a very settled so-called alleged civilization in West Bengal. At the same time, by the 1600s itself, there is a supposed high culture stuff happening in the West, where Muslim sultans and nawabs are finding fraternity with Bhadralok Bengalis. The relics of the Sena dynasty are collaborating with the upstarts of Persianate extraction, and there's this supposed high culture happening. And there are these unsettled barbarians who live in the East, right? Who don't need to be bothered with. We don't need to spread our culture to them. And they are unsettled people. And that bunch of people suddenly start finding their feet, taking root. Okay. And when we talk about roots and settledness, and then suddenly you look at, okay, how deep are the roots? These roots are not any deeper than the paddy that they grow, no? Paddy has very shallow roots, no?
Right.
It can get just like washed away in one gust of wind or a flood. And that has been what has defined the lives of these Chasha Jolaha people of the East and across religion. Because this working class population, yes, largely influenced by Islam, but also by other liberational theological movements such as Chaitanya and what have you, Bhakti and all of that. So then later on the Motua movement came about, and so many other attempts have been made in this region to help the non-Muslim oppressed castes also break out of their chains. And so in this long history of extraction oppression, you see this period of some settledness, which is between 1600s and let's say for about 2 odd centuries before the British come. And then we see this Hahakaar again starting, right? Which is what? Which is the British are on this mission to replace Muslim authority. And the white man can't see the distinction between a Jolaha Chasha and a, Ashraf, Sayyid, Khan, Pathan, and, that kind of person, right? For them, they're all people who are Muslims and who are a threat to their authority. And they launch into this process of subordination by privileging the Bhadralok Hindu over the Muslim. And then in the British period, you see this huge downfall, which is what Hunter's work talks about, where, there's a dispossession that happens. A certain aristocratic class vanishes, the Ashrafite class vanishes, and the non-Ashraf classes are pushed into penury and, Hahakaar. Okay. So this stuff is happening. So what am I talking about? Okay, how do I bring this back? There is settledness, there is this liberation theology, and then there is this huge disruption in the form of British colonial rule, followed by Bhadralok Ashraf rule. Can I call it that?
Sure.
So the colonial period is followed by this contest between the two ruling classes of Bengal, the Ashraf ruling class and the Bhadralok ruling class. They snatch, like two dogs, they snatch two parts of the pie apart. Okay. And the others basically got stuck in either part of the pie. And today you have what? You have the land of the Bengali Muslim, you say, is far exceeds Bangladesh. The traditional land, the homestead of the Bangladeshi is across this entire region. Assam se lekar, even Myanmar and all of that. And, just as the same thing applies to the Bengali Dalit, by the way. The same experience, right? The Namashudra Rajabangshi populations are from this region. But can you pinpoint their location? No. Why? Because just like the Bangladeshi Muslim, they've been taken to where they're required. They had very little role in their own mobility. They're indentured labor in Assam, they're indentured labor in Arakan, they're taken away to Singapore, they're taken away to Southeast Asian ports to work there. And then suddenly when you look at this as a horrible civilizational churning, you see that, hey, this is happening in three nations in South Asia. The Punjabi nation, the Bengali nation, and the Tamil nation are providing slave labor to the world. Right? Okay, coming back, this Namashudra question, right? Now what your book talks about is the Muslim question, says that to the Indian, this person is just a Muslim, not a Bengali Muslim at one level, or a Bangladeshi. Right. But if you look at the Dalit, the Namashudra Rajabangshi in Bangladesh, they are just Hindu. Their caste is not taken into consideration, not even the fact that their experience has been quite in common with the Bengali Muslim experience. And there should be greater fraternity there. Saying, Amrao Chasha Jolaha, Amrao Mundol Bishas, Tumrao Mundol Bishas. That thing is somehow missing in terms of an ideological, political offering on both sides of the border.
No, that's absolutely right. That, the kind of lack of solidarity that you would expect, right? But then, there's a lot that you said, Sudipto. But, one thing that I think, I want to highlight in this narrative is that how, the privileging of Hindus or the Bhadralok during the colonial period had material effects, right, on education, on institution building, and so on, right? And how part of the reason why, and I think this is important, because I think what I try to do here in my book, and I think this is worth bearing in mind whenever we work in South Asia, is how easily we get into these settled answers about animosity, right? Of course, we hate Muslims because we hate Muslims, right? And then there's no good way to sort of come out of it. So it's always filled with despair, right? There's no room outside of it because it's always kind of marred by this kind of hatred, right? And so I point this out to sort of point out how Muslim opposition to colonial rule was in part responsible for how colonizers wanted to do away with Muslims, right? So it wasn't that they were really saying that, we prefer Hindus over Muslims for, identity reasons, but that they were essentially offering favors to those who were making their jobs easy, right? And it was the Bhadralok community, right? And so as we see from colonial documents, that as they tried to create an Indian middle class, they chose the Bhadralok because they were the most malleable, right? In terms of who can become the brown Englishman, who can be educated like the Englishmen, and so on, right? And the Ashraf Muslims at the time, who were actually educated, like you pointed out, they were educated, and they opposed colonial expansion here. Right. And they didn't really want to offer the kind of support, right? And so they were kind of marginalized. And I think that this is where the competition emerges. Perhaps they thought that they would be able to win this competition, right? Without the privilege they gained from colonizers, but that was a losing battle, right? And so there is this kind of a prehistory that takes us to the more contemporary period, where we see the effect and the difference in terms of institutional building, in terms of education capacity. Right? And I think I think there was a time when I used to think that education is a red herring, right? That we blame lack of education on everything. But I think, in more recent years, I've been more sympathetic to that reading and in recognizing how that actually is important, not just in terms of skills, but also in terms of, creating an environment where you question things, where you stand up for yourself and so on, the political culture that it allows, right? And I guess in so doing, thinking also about the culture of dissent and resistance in India as opposed to Bangladesh. I think in Bangladesh, people are more complacent, right? As opposed to in India, right? Where people will actually fight against injustice, even in their small groups, even in their small factories and so on. They will speak up for what is right in a way that people here will say that, we are grateful for what there is, at least we have, we get a meal once a day, it could have been worse, thank God for what we have, that kind of a thing, right? There is this sort of, differentiation that we can have, but I digress. So to then sort of think about solidarities, right? I think to think about solidarities, what we need to really think about is whether people actually recognize what's in their material interest, whether people recognize their shared material interests, right? Or are they allowing themselves to be divided along identity markers, right? Which is, what is it that makes a Hindu a Hindu? What is it that makes a Muslim, right? And what is the work that they're doing? Right? And I think here is the sort of inherent contradiction in caste categories also, right? If it is that we are categorizing on the basis of work, then how is it that we are also able to create this divided rule, right? Because that's the sort of inherent contradiction there too, because what we have been able to do is sort of, like you said, identify caste as a Hindu problem and not a Muslim problem. And so depending on which side of the border you are, being a Muslim is worse, or being a low caste Hindu is worse, right? And whichever you is a little better, you sort of feel better about yourself by marginalizing the other, right? Instead of sort of thinking about how it's the Dalit identity of Muslims that help with the marginalization of Muslims, or sometimes the Muslim identity of Dalit that allow for their marginalization. That this inability, to recognize how they participate in their own subjugation, their own marginalization, how in not recognizing it, they're actually consuming the majoritarian ideas about difference, right? The majoritarian ideas about, belonging, right? So I think there is that, and again, it has to do with work. But having said that, I'm going to say that what was really interesting as I was doing this research for my book is to see how borderlands are actually different. That, away from the border, it's easier for us to say that, here are these very different categories and they're kind of disparate and they're not really working together. But then you go into these border areas and you realize that, there is a lot of, they said, milemishe. আমরা মিলেমিশে থাকি, we live together, we stay together, right? And you'd see that in their everyday engagement. You would see that in how they protect one another, right? From border guards, from the other state, from different middlemen and so on, right? And how there is this entire information economy where, they protect one another. Right. So there's that, right? And in a way, that's the source of hope, right? That they're working here. But I think there's also this other sadder element there. This recognition that these are the parts that have been neglected by neoliberal development, right? These are parts that have been allowed to sort of self-destruct, if you will, right? These are the parts where they have very little state support. And so these are also the parts where there is this strong sense of neoliberal sensibility, right? Because they know that the state, Indian or Bangladeshi, will not come to their rescue no matter what. So this shared understanding comes from this experience of being neglected by their respective governments. And so it's in these borders, they'll say that, what does it matter if I'm an Indian or a Bangladeshi? They'll say this openly to you in a way that you will probably never hear anywhere else, right? To sort of, do away with their nationalist identity. Oh my goodness, how is that possible? And here they will tell you that what does it matter? And so there were occasions where they said that, here we are, this group of friends here, we are a mixed group. This person is from Bangladesh, this person is from India, this, that. And, we come and go. Right? And so it's not just, solidarity among Muslims and Dalits, but also solidarity across borders, where they see this entire borderland space as somehow integrated, right? As a space where they belong, a space where their respective states want control, a place where their respective states want a border to cut through, and obviously a place where crossing comes with a great penalty, even death, and yet in their imagination and in their activities also, there is this idea of a shared space, and so this is so for me this was really a kind of heartbreaking kind of sense of solidarity here. That on the one hand, these people here, they are among the most marginalized in both countries, right? Economically, for the most part, they've been sort of left off. I call this neoliberal neglect.
Yeah, two communities left out in both countries.
Yes. Communities left out in both countries. Right.
Yeah.
And they're surviving. And their survival is built upon this solidarity that they share. Right? But even there, what was interesting, and I guess this is this is why it's so contradictory also, right? We can't tell a good story, without there being a caveat. Right, because there's this story of underdevelopment and neglect, but at the same time, so this particular village that I visited, which was right next to a land port, this is where I spent some time in. And which is where they said that, we all live together, we're happily living together, and yet they had different lanes for Hindus and Muslims. Here's the Hindu lane and here's the Muslim lane. So they live together in parallel lanes. You know what I mean? And then they'll say that, well, so I said to them that what kind of living together is this? You just said that this is living together, we live together, but here's the Muslim lane, here's the Hindu lane. And then they're explaining that no, we live together. It's only because of the smell, because of the, because they cook fish and all that, so it's just because of that. And of course, that's a caste marker, right? That odor is one of those.
No, but who has a problem with frying fish in that part of the world? Is it fish or beef? What is the food divide? Is it on
fish or beef? I mean, I think depending on who you ask, right? So it would be either fish or beef, or whatever food, it's like food related. It's smells that separate them. That we just want our kitchens to be a little separate because I think you're right. I mean, this is also a population that also eats everything. It's not that they're really being very picky and casteist about what they eat, and yet I think it's about what they will cook. You know what I mean? So they're differentiating things that they can eat in a cooked form versus what you can touch or cook yourself. Something very intricate like that, which, unless you actually go there and you see that they're doing this, you won't actually know that they're doing this because, if you see them together, you'll see that they're sharing things and so on, and that's not a problem. And yet the cooking is, you know what I mean? So here are the sort of subtle ways in which you realize caste practices have found their way in, that there are these ways that they're objectively sort of seeing each other as different, but then they're not going to actually admit it. And I think in so doing, they are cognizant of the fact that, in other parts, people are fighting. These are populations that are fighting one another. So there's a sort of sense, I think, of relativism, right? That, relatively speaking, we're living together, we're not fighting, we're not killing one another, so on and so forth. So what, there are these two lanes, so which is why these are the spaces where there is, all of this kind of intermixed, right? And I think this is how, where I think we realize that, more than borders, it's these kinds of categories that have separated people more, right? That this very dangerous border where people die, this one of the most dangerous borders in the world, that doesn't keep them apart from communicating, from getting in touch, from sharing a smoke, but smell does. You know what I mean? So I think, so there is that, which, and the other aspect, of course, is to then think about, is it only when things are really dire that you realize that, okay, that's where there is shared solidarity? Do we not recognize that there's room for solidarity when things are not so bad, when we are not both being neglected by our states?
Interesting. No, and when you talk about this majoritarian construction, it is so interesting that a minority always ends up constructing the majoritarian ideology. In India, we say that the Brahman Baniya collaboration is what is right wing at its very core, at the level of their nucleus, that is where it comes from. In Bangladesh, what I've heard is that there is also that collaboration at the top between, and also in India, so there's this Brahmin Baniya collaboration. But of course, on the other hand, we also see a very small minority, but very influential minority among Muslims who are able to now cut across this barrier of religion, collaborate with the Brahmin Baniya in so many other ways. So there's this, this remnants of a very old, ancient collaboration between two ruling classes, which you will find evidence of even today in India. And I dare say that is in fact the thing that is keeping actual progressive politics from happening in India, the support of elite Muslims to formations such as the Congress, let's say. Right? The Congress or even the TMC. The TMC may speak on behalf of persecuted Muslims, but the people who they will give tickets to will be Ashraf Muslims. Right? The Congress will talk about the persecution of Muslims without taking into account the fact that 90% of Muslims in India are also caste oppressed, not just oppressed because of their religion. So the Congress will, because there has been no honest attempt at understanding gradations among Muslims in India, the Congress gets away by saying, this Muslim is there, no candidate. But there is no further investigation into what is the origin or what's the background of this particular Muslim. You will find that they are all aristocratic in extraction, people with privilege. Okay, so now from Bangladesh's story, I want to understand from you: is there is quite a small sliver, but significant sliver of Bhadralok capitalism over there, Hindu Bhadralok capitalism, which collaborates very well, supposedly, with a certain capitalistic class among the Muslim population. Now, further from there, I don't know much. Okay, what I want to know is that this Ashraf-Ajlaf divide, this Persianate Bengali Muslim divide, how does it play out today in terms of capital and wealth distribution? And before you answer that, one of the mysteries or ironies rather of Bangladesh, when I started reading about this Muslim question, is the two great protagonists of Bangladesh, post-colonial protagonists, right? General Zia and Mujib, Sheikh Mujib. So Sheikh Mujib is of an Ashraf extraction, but his entire ideology, his worldview is shaped by his opposition to pan-Islamism, his opposition to this supposed organic fraternity that exists between a Pakistani Pathan and a Bengali Muslim. He opposed that kind of artificial thing. So, and despite the fact that he himself is from that Persian Ashraf extraction. And then you have a character like General Zia, who is actually a Mondal. He is a non-Ashraf, perhaps in Indian terms you would call him a Pasmanda Muslim, who is the flag bearer of this pan-Islamic identity, who wants to reclaim lost fraternity with Pakistan, with West Asia and all of that. So today, how is this Ashraf, non-Ashraf thing playing out in Bangladesh, you think?
This is a language that is not used here. No one will call themselves Ashraf Muslim or Athraf Muslim or any of that. And I'll say that it's only, when I started...
In India also, it's not like Muslims will say we are Ashraf or not, but then, and they will say that there is no caste. And then we say that, hey, that's why there needs to be a census and a survey to find out what different types of Muslims there are. So anyway, sorry, I cut you there, but yeah.
So they will not say that there is, there isn't even a sense that there could be like a Sunni or a Shia, and I guess that's partly, because the Bengali Muslim population here is very homogenous in that sense, that, and I think partly that, and B, my sense is that, because of this sort of fluid sense of what Islam is, and the kind of presupposition of Sunni Islam, there was never a debate about what type of Muslim we are, so that doesn't really pan out. So there is, and I think, so there's on the one hand that, but on the other hand, you do have a small population where people will draw connections to Persia, to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, to all, the sort of, closer to the Middle East and so on, or Urdu speaking families and so on, which would be seen as more aristocratic or, tied with the Nawab family and so on. So there's that, but not a politically salient group as such, right? So there's some people who have these aristocratic ties, but that's about it. In a more general sense, I think the assumption is that it's fairly more homogeneous, which as we know, that's not necessarily true, right? That even through class markers, through behaviors, and so on, you see, there is a certain variation. But I think the one of the critical aspects have been how religious practice has not really been something that's politically negotiated, partly because, Bangladesh emerges in opposition to a certain kind of religious fraternity, as you just said. So that meant that you privilege other parts of your identity also. So you happen to be Muslim, but you're also some of these other things. And then even when you are Muslim, you have this sort of fluid sense of Islam to refer to, right? So among the more educated middle class population, this has been the negotiation between a Muslim and a Bengali identity, like, something that is not conflictual because it's part of, our many sides. This fits nicely within that framework. Right? And, even, in a sort of a rural sense, I think, again, given the agrarian basis, there was never really that sense that you had to, dress in a certain way or practice religion in a certain way other than the personal. I think what changes is globalization, right? What changes is neoliberalism, right? So, Bangladesh, as one of the early adopters of neoliberalism, opened its economy in the 70s, right? It had this bureau called the Manpower Bureau, Labor and Manpower Bureau, to send workers abroad in menial sectors, to work in menial sectors, primarily in the Gulf states, in Southeast Asia, and so on. And so, right, soon after the country emerges, there are two things that's happening, right? The emergence of NGOs, where Western donors, because of corruption, don't want to give money to the government. They would rather give money to NGOs. And so that's where money is being channeled into. But even then, there's a bit of a conflict, right? Which type of NGOs? Rights-based NGOs or development sector NGOs, right? And of course, in the interest of global capitalism, it's the latter that wins out. Not NGOs that are about political rights, that are about, demanding various forms of rights or entitlements, but those NGOs that would help with, social welfare kinds of things, right? That the state usually takes charge of, but here the NGOs will increasingly do that because donors want to fund NGOs and not the state. So there's that's happening. And then there's this emphasis on migrant workers to be sent off, and then the garments industry. So these are the three main developments that's taking place in Bangladesh in the 70s, or between, not early 70s, say mid to late 70s. Yeah. And so what that does is, and I think this is why it's a little bit confusing, right? In terms of thinking about what type of Muslim are people in Bangladesh? Is it a uniform thing, right? And because, changes are coming in already, even as you emerge as an independent state, saying that we are the kind of secular, moderate Muslim, and then, you send a large part of your population into the Middle East, where they are seeing a different kind of Islam. Where they're going there and they're seeing that, wait, the way we've been doing Islam was maybe not correct. Maybe this is the Sahih Islam, and we should be practicing that. Wait, our women wear the sari, and they show half of their bodies as they work. Maybe that is not the right type of Islam. They should be covered up. Or this is not the education that our children are receiving. Maybe they should be doing that. Okay? And then alongside what we see is money coming in from the Middle East to fund madrasas, to fund mosques. Right, in many of these rural areas, right, and so as part of the economic plan, then, given such a large poor population, the way that the education system fails us is through this kind of a discrimination, right? That if you are able to afford it, or if you are very smart, you get into these very good elite public schools, or you go to private schools, and the vast majority would have to go to these madrasas, right? And so it's there that the socio-cultural transformation is taking place between madrasas taking up a large share of the education, and migrant workers, where it's only men that are going, who are learning a different type of Islam and bringing that back into Bangladesh. Yes.
Yes, no, you talked about this, what kind of Muslim are we? And that can be answered in two ways. Again, theologically, how do we interpret the doctrine is one way of asking the question of what kind of Muslim we are. The other way is, of course, the kind of social justice way of asking, ki are you Ashraf, are you Sayyid, or are you Pasmanda? At least that's the way in which these questions are asked in India. At least there's some attempt to ask these questions in India. And I want to give you a citation here of the West Bengal OBC Commission, right? The Backward Classes Commission in West Bengal. So there was left rule in Bengal, as you know, for the longest time. CPIM was in charge. For all this time, they didn't go into an investigation into the chains of the Bengali Muslim and, look at what kind of caste oppressive experiences they might have and all this. That exercise happens for the first time in 2011. And the Backward Classes Commission comes up with this very, very interesting report, which says that in some cases, the communities' Hindu counterparts in other states had already been classified as OBCs, or in some cases, scheduled castes. So you have, for example, the Napith, which is the Barber, and so many other similar kind of communities, which the Hindu counterparts have either got OBC status or SC status also. They say, the thing says, the commission said that the communities were treated like scheduled castes in their new faith of Islam, with evidence of them being asked to hold namaz separately. Okay, and through this process in 2011, they identified 35 communities who were added to the OBC list in West Bengal. And see, there's one other very mean-minded kind of bureaucratic twist that they've given the social justice program in India, which is that you cannot be SC if you are not Hindu, Sikh or Buddhist. Scheduled caste, you cannot be if you are Muslim.
Yeah, so you have to be OBC. Mm-hmm.
You will be put in the OBC list. If you are backward and if you're Christian, if you're backward and you're Muslim, you're put in the OBC list. So there are communities of Muslims in West Bengal, Bengali Muslims, who were treated as supposedly untouchables in their new faith, asked to pray separately, and yet they're not benefiting from those provisions. Say, for example, like you have in India something called the Atrocities Act, Prevention of Atrocities Act, which prevents segregation, which prevents atrocities based on race. So a person classified as OBC, a Dalit Muslim or a Dalit Christian, cannot even invoke an atrocity because they are not SC. And the Atrocities Act is supposedly only for SCs. Okay, all these weirdities happen. Now, that takes me to the question as to, hello, these are the same people across the border, just 100 kilometers on the other side of the border. That person is reduced to just a Bengali Muslim. And perhaps there should have been an investigation into what is the ethnicity, or rather more than the ethnicity, what is there beyond the ethnicity in that identity. And again, that leads me to wonder, what if in the case of somebody like Jogendranath Mondal, who was your first law minister, of Pakistan. Like India had the first law minister was Ambedkar. The first law minister of Pakistan was Jogendranath Mondal, who was a kind of mentee of Ambedkar, whose project was to find this common intersection between the Jolaha Chasha Muslim and the Jolaha Chasha Hindu, to say that ours is a common problem, right? Now, if we had gone down that path, we all know that Jogendranath Mondal was defeated by this Islamist upsurge post Liaquat Ali's, takeover and all of that, and he came back to West Bengal. Okay, but like in India, if there was an investigation into caste in Bangladesh, would we today be in a better position to understand why Boshirul Mondal is out there in some Marathali of Bengaluru collecting garbage and not some other kind of person from Bangladesh? Is that Mondal a signifier of something else in addition to the fact that they're from Bangladesh?
Like you had said earlier, that in Bangladesh, just like how in India, there's this sort of homogenization of Muslims, there's a homogenization of Hindus too. In a certain way, you don't really differentiate between different Hindus, which might be a good thing or a bad thing, right? Because you're sort of, I don't know, it's just the sort of like a Assamese form of equal hatred, irrespective of who you are, and then that's what their non-communal position is. Right? It's in a way, it's a bit like that, but at the same time, it depends on the context, right? That there will be a certain kind of caste preference, right? If you are to be seen with someone, if you are giving opportunities with someone, there will be a certain affinity towards the upper caste. That's also true. But in a more generalized sense, I don't think there's much of a sense in terms of where these distinctions lie. And I think that, like we see in India, that creates its own problems, right? Because that means you can identify them in any way that you want. If you want them to be upper caste, they're upper caste. If you want them to be lower caste, they're lower caste. Whatever suits your purpose, right? You manipulate that in order to, make whatever argument you want, positive or negative, right? But, so it's, in a way, it's sort of simplified, but you will also see that there are certain, like token Hindus in positions of power who they will point out to you to say that, look, Hindus are doing really well. There is also, like you said, a fairly prominent Bhadralok capitalist, Hindu Bhadralok capitalist class in Bangladesh also who are doing fairly well. If you look at Bangladeshi cultural spheres like music and dance and theater and so on, again, you will see a significant presence of Hindu artists, in a variety of ways. Do they face prejudice? Absolutely, they face prejudice in their own ways, right? But it's a little different from the class prejudice that more, obviously that lower income Hindus would face, right? But alongside, what I think is useful to bear in mind, there is a mirror image that takes place in Bangladesh in a way that it does in West Bengal, right? In a way that the Bengali Muslim is invisibilized, so is the poor Bengali Hindu. Right? I think in a sort of similar way, you'd kind of like wish them away as if they don't exist. So the only Hindus that exist in Bangladesh would be the educated Hindu, the well-to-do Hindu, the artistically gifted Hindu, but not the lower caste, not the poor. Those would be the ones that you wouldn't really want to see very much. But of course, that's the city speaking, right? That's your urban bias, right? Which is very similar to the say Kolkata bias in West Bengal. It's not that the Bengali Muslims don't exist. Go to Murshidabad, go to Malda. You'll find them. They're there everywhere, right? Similarly, you go to these bordering areas. Go to Jashore, go to Khulna. You will find Hindu families there, but in the sort of generic imagination, they don't really exist, which is why, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that, you kind of then deny the kind of problem that there exists in terms of Hindus actually wanting to leave Bangladesh. Are there Hindus who want to leave Bangladesh and go to India? There are, we've seen declines in Hindu populations, right? So that has to be accounted for to a certain degree. But at the same time, are there exaggerated readings of that? Are there exaggerated readings of Hindu oppression in Bangladesh? There's that too, right? So in the post-uprising period, all these sensationalized news about Hindu genocide in Bangladesh, these are all lies. In fact, and here's the sort of political prowess of some of these organizers during the uprising is that, in fact, post-uprising, many of these students went and guarded mandirs and majars and so on, so that, they wouldn't come under attack, so that, because we know that, that we've seen this during partition, we've seen this during different periods of political change, that opportunistically minorities get targeted. Right, and there's a political motive there. Often, it's a move to destabilize. Often, but so they were smart enough to actually, go and guard these spaces. Right, so that's where the kind of problem emerges, because you realize that politics across the border has an impact on politics here, right? So are Hindus marginalized here? Absolutely, right? There's no denying that, right? But it's not in the scale that the sensationalist journalism would have you believe, right? But at the same time, I think what makes them more vulnerable is when politicians on the other side target Bangladeshis, right? That when there is this sense that all that language about termites and insects and infiltrators and so on. So unfortunately, Hindus then become the proxy Indian, right? And so your anti-Indian sentiments take effect or find expression in this a certain kind of minority attack.
No, it is so. It's a tragedy. It's an irony that they are referred to as Indians, because those who we today consider Indians in the western side of Bengal are people who conspire to make sure that these populations fall into East Bengal. Okay, and here I just want to refer to some very, very important work. I did this in the past also with the conversation I had with Nadira Khatun. I want to bring attention to this once again. This great collaboration that happened between the Hindu Mahasabha and the Congress in 1946 as the maps were being drawn out for partition, in which the Mahasabha and the Congress both realized that they need to contest not just Muslim politics, but also Namashudra or Dalit politics at that time. And what they realized in terms of how the demographic spread was in the region is that, yes, there was a greater population of Muslims towards the east, but there was also a greater population of Namashudras to the east. So in drawing out their map, look at their cynicism. They draw out a map in such a way that they push not just the Muslim areas to the east, but also the Namashudra areas to the east. And the new international border which they propose, and in this again, once again, I want to bring attention to the fact that this is not just the Hindu Mahasabha, it is also the Congress party, the so-called secular, which agreed on this borderline, which resulted in suddenly a state in which artificially a Bhadralok was in charge. But by this process of exclusion, you made sure that democracy can either mean representation or it can mean majority rule, right? Representative democracy is one thing and then majority rule is another thing. So they created an artificial majority in the West by surgically removing the Namashudra areas and putting them towards the east. And another political thing contributed to this, which is the politics of the All India Scheduled Caste Federation led by Jogendranath Mondal in Bengal at that time. Their entire political line was this, that we have to isolate the extractor. We have to isolate the extractor and find a common political ground between Dalits and Muslims, because Dalits and Muslims are not just Hindu and Muslim. Both are actually Dalit. Okay, and that is what our politics can be built upon, is what was his thing. So that became a threat to the Bhadralok. And they said, ek taraf throw the Bengali Muslim, throw this Jogendranath Mondal also on the other side. Right? And after the partition finally happens in 1947, you will see any number of Dalit groups petitioning the governments on both sides, saying that our district has come off on this side now. And that tragedy, right, cannot be overlooked when you have a situation like this where these people are being referred to as Indian. And now the descendants of the Hindu Mahasabha are giving out like these announcements to these people in Bangladesh, supposedly who are Hindu, saying that come to India, we will give you scheduled caste status. Okay, we are doing NRC, CAA, come back to India.
Ghar wapas.
No, the hypocrisy of the whole thing, it is because of you that these people are on the other side of the border in the first place, because of your own Hindu exclusionary upper caste mind. And now today you're building another kind of politics on the backs of the same people who you threw out to the other side. uh,
No, what's interesting also is that, when they did the land boundary agreement, right? And where they swapped the enclaves, and very few people actually swapped, right? And I think that was so profound in a way, because that came at a time when India wanted to say that all of these Hindus, they want to come to India, that all these Bangladeshis, they're just dying to come to India. And then when there was a legal pathway, they didn't actually take it, right? Very few people did, right? That, so that kind of gives us a sense of how, convoluted, and also how rhetorical so much of this is, right? These claims are really not grounded in reality, and that, and I think that's the thing, right? That, even if it's difficult, they're still here. They've still found community, and they're I think one thing that I think is interesting about Bangladesh, I think, again, relative to India, and maybe that is part of the explanation here, is how mobile people actually are, right? And I think, one thing that that we can also historically think about, and then sort of bring that into the present, is to sort of think about this area as a frontier region, right? Because of this sort of sense of mobility, the sense that, with shifting rivers, you have to move, because, these are not fixed lands, right? And so that kind of creates a sense that, you are always moving, you're always looking for greener pastures, and that's okay. Again, in terms of neoliberal sensibility, that's very much that true, that, of course, greener pastures, you should go and be able to reap those benefits, right? And so there is that sense that, a certain common sense that you should be able to go, you should be able to transcend borders, you should be able to go and find jobs where things are a little better, right? But I think at the same time, that when the counterpart creates a sense that, okay, even as we are mobile, we need a home, right? And so there's a kind of gendered difference here, right? The men will be mobile, the women will be the bearer of the home. And, in so doing, there's this sense that, and I think this is kind of counterproductive, right? Where we sort of see the men as being this patriarchal, having this patriarchal position in the household. Here we have all these women-dominated households, right? Because the men are mobile and the women are basically holding down court in these places, right? And so that's the kind of shifting place, again, that we have, again, historically as well as in the contemporary period. But I think that is what disallows a certain kind of formalization. So when they say that, okay, all of you just go to India and then, we'll give you your papers and so on and everything will be fine, there's some resistance to it, because having lived an informal life for so many years, they don't want a formal life, so to speak. So, in my interviews, when I asked them, so are you going to go? In my interviews also, many, so, this was just months before the agreement. So I went to some of these areas and I asked them, so are you going to go? And they said, most of them said that, no. What are we going to do there? Here, I know how to work the system here. I've built my lives around here. I know what to do. What am I going to do there? I have no one over there. This, we in our head, we might imagine there's this and that and this and that, but none of it actually exists. Right? And so this realization that this, even as things are difficult, as minorities, as Hindus, they've figured it out, right? And, through mobility, through hard work, through deception, or for however they've been able to do that with fake papers, they've been able to do that. And that they don't want the sense of security that might actually mean more hardship in a certain way, right? And so again, I think I can come back to the sense of perceived freedom that they have, right? Things might be really bad, and the lives they lead can be insecure to foreign eyes like ours, but for them, there is value to the freedom that they've worked towards and have achieved in a certain way, despite the peril, despite the insecurity. And I think that kind of, in part, maybe explains both the kind of solidarity that exists in these border lands and the desire for freedom, that I think in a way they have a better sense of what freedom might be than your average citizen, right? Having been or having lived this life where they are moving around, because I've heard all kinds of stories about how and on both sides, where people told me how they took all these different routes to travel around India or travel around Bangladesh, went to Dhaka, this Chittagong, this, that, came back, through Dhubri, this, that, all, so all these routes that they've taken, and these are very, very difficult routes. But, what was instructive for me was also how proudly they told me all these quote unquote illegal stories, right? And at one point I said that, why are you telling me these things? These are illegal activities. What if I tell someone? And they just laughed at me, and then and again, quite uniformly, they would just well, why would you do that? Ha ha ha, who are you going to tell? That kind of a response, right? And so in that, I think I don't know, maybe I try to check myself of the romanticism. Maybe it's so easy to romanticize that.
Naveen, no, don't stop yourself from romanticizing this. Why should this be romanticized? Because of all the unromantic stuff that has also happened. No, the unromantic stuff is what? That two sets of people argued that there is a possibility for a nation defined by religion on both sides of the border. And everything that has happened since the drawing of that border actually cocks a snook at that logic. The choices that people have made, expose how ridiculous the border was. Why do I say this? Okay, if the logic of partition were to be true, then today you wouldn't have had such a large Muslim Bengali population in West Bengal, right? All of them should have gone off to Bangladesh. You shouldn't have had such a large...
I think that's the thing. That's, I'm sorry, I didn't get to that point that you're making about, the myth of religious homogeneity, right? That these are uniformly religious places, right? That here is the land of Hindus and here is the land of Muslims. That is not the case. That is just factually incorrect, right? That, we only have to look around to recognize the farce in that religion-based nationalism, right? It hasn't served anyone. In India struggles with it on a daily basis, from, what's the term that you use, from Kanyakumari to where?
Kashmir. Kashmir is contested by Kanyakumari.
Right. So, throughout there in Pakistan, even in present day Pakistan, with the different provinces in Balochistan and Sindh and so on, the kind of religious harmony that they imagined just doesn't exist, right? And it's a myth, right? Yet, on the one hand, we recognize this, but on the other hand, these myths have had real power in shaping division. And I think this is what boggles the mind, right? That anyone who thinks through it will know that, of course, this makes no sense.
And yet, though there is so much tragedy in all of this, for me, the real standout or something to feel to smile about, let's even say, is how, people are made to, the fundamentalists on both sides are made to look silly by the facts on the ground. So the fundamentalists in India said, oh, let's throw out the infiltrator, let's do NRC. Okay. But when the NRC was finally done, what did it show? That out of the 17 lakh people, a majority of the people were non-Muslim, not even Bengali. Not Bengali Muslim for sure. Right. So definitely, where's the Bangladeshi trope? SIR happens in Bengal, West Bengal. Out of the nearly 1 crore people who are left out of the electoral roll, once again, it's not just Muslims. There's a huge Dalit population. So the two Dalit-Muslim populations over here invariably come up on top when you getting into any kind of investigation about, citizenship, not just citizenship, but even this question of haves and have-nots. When you just filter it out, all the have-nots end up being Dalit and Muslim. Then there is so much stuff for Bangladesh.
And that's the farce, right? About documentation and the demand for documentation, right? Within NRC-CAA, also in Myanmar with the Rohingya crisis, this demand at a time when no one had paperwork for home titles or birth certificates and so on, to demand that you provided these things. You're only really creating a market for forgery, right? So that doesn't actually do anything. Again, this is not rocket science. I think everyone knows this, right? Everyone knows that these are just ways to exclude certain people, right? And yet this sort of document fetishism remains, right? You use that sense of a document to, the thing that I think, that people in Bangladesh worry about is this push-in thing, right? That periodically the people are pushed in from India in the name of, them being Bangladeshi.
So from this side, we call it push back, by the way. Just...
That's right. Epar Opar, push in, push back.
In tragedy also there's a little bit of comedy. But Naveen, I think this is where we need to actually call it, for now at least. We've covered a lot of ground. We have come to this point finally where we are able to establish through this conversation itself the ridiculousness of the ideologies that predominate on both sides of the border.
But I think I just want to make just one last comment then, which is about, how, while all of this is ridiculous, I think we can agree that this is all ridiculous. But, also think about, again, coming back to my book, about how these are shaped by the work that we do, right? And I think this is why I wanted to sort of pick up on the caste description of work, right? That, if a system that organizes people on the basis of work, then, how that as a pre-capitalist form, sort of in the post-capitalist period, morphs into one that maintains the same kinds of hierarchy, right? So as opposed to it being progress, it's actually regress, right? Because now it becomes far more violent, it becomes far more hierarchical, it becomes far more rigid, right? More so than during the colonial period, where you cannot cross these boundaries, right? So your Swiggy driver will necessarily be of a certain caste, class, religious makeup, right? That you cannot transcend these boundaries becomes a problem. And it has to do with the hierarchies that have to do with not just religion, but also language, of regionalism, and so on, where in this neoliberal age, there is a preference for a certain kind of English-speaking capabilities, which again maps onto your education system, maps onto who has access to these institutions of learning, and again, the kind of hierarchy that exists there, right? And so I think we are not, on the one hand, these divisions are farce. On the other hand, these are so institutionalized, at every level in Bangladesh and in India, right? That these emerge as these parallel movements, right? And then you have the emergence of the right wing again in India, in a position of state power, in Bangladesh as an emergent entity, but yet these are again very, very similar entities. They want exactly the same kinds of things. And again, they will talk about religion, but what they're really trying to do is control women, control work, create a sense of belonging that necessarily tries to marginalize another group, right? And so they play off one another. So the BJP there empowers the Jamaat-e-Islami here, the Jamaat-e-Islami here empowers the BJP over there, right? They provide fodder for each other in order to move forward with their xenophobic, casteist, hierarchical rhetoric, right? And so, again, you and me recognizing the farce in all of this actually doesn't, and I guess that's the sort of, sad part here. It doesn't do away with the way in which these differences have been institutionalized, right? And entrenched with capitalist norms, with capitalist societies and management at the very core, right? And so it's no longer just about, we don't like one another just because there's a border. We've learned to we've been fashioned to dislike one another, but also that this dislike has become embedded in everyday life, in the work that we do, and in the sort of capitalist norms that have, to varying degrees in these two countries, have come to shape our views of ourselves and of our perceived other.
I'm just going to let it sink what you said. I don't want to add a word to what you said because I couldn't have concluded better. All of what I wanted to say came through in that last part which you talked about, how we are not defined either by our religion or these political parties which are trying to divide us along those lines. Naveen, I can't think of this as an ending but a beginning, because I feel there is more than anything else. I'm very serious about this. I think there needs to be collaborative work. There needs to be we need to exhume a lot more. We need to perhaps, do these joint investigative projects. And I want to also remind you about this conversation once again that I had with Nadira Khatun. So Nadira is somebody who comes from West Bengal, and she's somebody who understands the context over there. The dream team would be for all of us to really be working out there in the field, investigating, finding people's stories and putting this together. I hope to see that day, if there is ever the possibility for that to happen. But Inshallah. I hope that happens someday. But I think one thing I'm going to try and do from now that now that we know one another, is to come back to this conversation, because things, as you know, are developing very fast, both in terms of the climate disaster and the political climate that exists not just in Bangladesh, West Bengal, Assam, Myanmar. The Bengali nation really has been split among these land masses, and our people are like Hahakaar hocche. So I hope we can get to that conversation. I don't want to discuss all these things straight away, but these conversations have to happen periodically. And with that hope, I want to conclude this episode.
Absolutely. That is, this is more, now more than ever, we really need a collaborative approach.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Navine Murshid. I've waited really long for this conversation to happen. It was so worth it. Thank you so very much. Thank you also, Dr. Nadira Khatun. When I started having that conversation with you, Nadira, you might remember I was all at sea. I was reading all this material. I was not able to make sense of it. If it weren't for your support and help in curating these conversations, this wouldn't have happened. It's a little delayed. It should have come before the Bengal elections. But again, resources are a crunch. Deadlines are always extra hard for us out here in the independent media, because we just don't have people to throw at a problem. So this has taken time to come through, this Bengal special series that I'm calling Epar Opar Hahakaar. But I'm leaving you with a promise that we will circle back to this conversation again and again, because that region we are speaking to is still volatile. Politics over there is still developing. For now, this is all we have. Naveen, sorry. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Sudipto.